In this next section, we're looking at how does the New Jerusalem compare with what we saw in the Millennium? What's the same and what's different? So here in this Millennium, what is the same and what is different? Any person who's going to look at the prophecies of the Old Testament in light of the New Testament has to account for the similarities between those Old Testament promises and what Revelation says about the New Jerusalem. You have to account for both the similarities, where the two things are saying the same thing, but you also have to account for what's different. If you ignore the similarities and just look at the differences, you're not handling it with integrity. You're changing things that don't fit into what you think. And the same thing with the differences. You have to account, why is it different this here, different to that there? If you turn around about the differences and say, well, those differences from the Old Testament, they don't count, they don't really mean that, you're not handling Scripture with integrity. You have to embrace the whole picture of Scripture and bring it together. And you have to say, why is it the same here and why is it different here? So the first thing we see is there's a new heavens and new earth. We read in Isaiah chapter 65, verse 17, a kingdom passage concerning the millennium, which says that God makes a new heavens and new earth. He creates it. The act of creation means it's something that only God can do. No one else can do it. So if you turn quickly to Isaiah chapter 65, verse 11, it says, "For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things will not be remembered or come to mind. But be glad and rejoice forever in what I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem for rejoicing and her people for gladness." That's the same wording as in Revelation. God is going to make a new heavens and new earth. But if you jump down to verse 20, it says, "No longer will there be in it an infant who lives but a few days and an old man who does not live out his days. For the youth will die at the age of 100, and the one who does not reach the age of 100 will be thought accursed." So here, where it says no death, we see a difference with this one. Isaiah 65, and then that's verse 20, says there is death in the new heavens and new earth. This says there's a new heavens and new earth, but here there is no death. But here there is death. On top of that, the new heavens and new earth of Revelation 21 is a brand new heavens and new earth. The former one has been completely done away with, completely eradicated. But turn to Zechariah 14, verse 10. Okay. "All the land will be changed into a plain from Geba to Rimmon south of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem will rise and remain on its site from Benjamin's gate as far as the place from the first gate to the corner gate, and from the Tower of Hananel to the king's winepress. People will live in it, and there will no longer be a curse." That word curse there is haram. Doesn't mean a curse as in this one, where there's no curse. So the word curse here is the word katathema, meaning curse. When they translated the Zechariah 14 verse 11 into Greek, they didn't use that word. they used another word, anathema, because the Hebrew word there is cherem, which means devoted to destruction. Destroyed. It will no longer be destroyed. It doesn't mean there won't be any curse whatsoever in any shape or form. It means Jerusalem will never be destroyed again. That's what it means. And so here, Jerusalem will become a place of security. So what we find in verse 10 is not that the whole earth has been done away with, but what is there has been remodeled into something new. It's been changed. It's been rejigged. It's been created into a brand new thing out of what already existed. Whereas this new heavens and new earth in the New Jerusalem is completely brand new, not recreated out of what pre-existed. Does that make sense? So Zechariah shows the new heavens and new earth is different. Is different in the millennium to the one in Revelation 21. But they're very, very similar, if that makes sense. They're very, very similar. So that's verse 11. In chapter 14, verse 8, it says there is no sea. Okay, Revelation chapter 21, verse 1, says there's no sea. But in Isaiah 14, is it Isaiah 14? Zechariah 14. Zechariah 14, verse 8, and in Ezekiel 47, verse 8, we see that the Western Sea, the Mediterranean, and the Eastern Sea, the Dead Sea, still exist. They're there in this kingdom, in this Jerusalem, but there is no sea at the time of the New Jerusalem. No longer any sea. Next thing is, here there is a high mountain. So some of these we won't see parallels or differences to, but here there's a high mountain, and we see in Ezekiel 40 verse 1 that in the New Jerusalem, in the Jerusalem of the Millennium, the time of the Millennium, there is also, Jerusalem also becomes a high mountain. We read that in Zechariah. In verse 12, it says there's 12 gates, and they'll never be shut. They'll never be shut. In Isaiah 60, verse 11, we see that the gates will never be shut. It's the same. Okay, I'll just read Isaiah 60, verse 11. Your gates will be open continually. They will not be closed day or night, so that men may bring to you the wealth of the nations where the kings led in procession. So we've got a few things there. Here, is it verse 24? But it says there the gates are not closed. We see that's similar. Isaiah 60, verse 11. But when God is the sun and the moon and the stars, there is no more night in the New Jerusalem. But here it's saying the gates are not closed day or night, which makes it different. There's no more night in this New Jerusalem, but it seems that there is night in this kingdom. And the kings of the nations bring the glory of the nations in Isaiah 60 verse 11, just as they do in the New Jerusalem. So the kings of the nations bring the glory of the nations into the New Jerusalem as they do in this kingdom. That's the same. Okay. Verse 24 and 26, 4 to 26, we see that the nations also walk by the light of the New Jerusalem, and that's the same here in Isaiah 60. That's also the same. We also see there's a river of life in the millennium. Zechariah 14 and verse 8, and in Ezekiel 47, verses 1 to 12. There's a river of life in the millennium, as there is in the New Jerusalem. In chapter 22, verse 2, it says there's no more curse. Now, in Deuteronomy, chapter 29 and 30, but let's go chapter 30, we see when Israel repents as a nation and experience the restoration as a nation, they will no longer experience the curse or the curses, but the curse is the curse of the law. Remember, Israel experienced the blessing of the law when they obeyed the law, and the curse of the law. There's nothing about the blessings of the law that says you will never ever die ever again. Doesn't say that there. What it means is God will send rain, and he'll cause the land to prosper, and he will cause the land to be fruitful. That's the blessing of the law. So when we say there's no curse in the millennium, we're not saying there's no curse whatsoever. There's no curse of the law for Israel. But we saw in Zechariah 14, and I've forgotten what the verse is, but it says, it's right at the end of the chapter. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 17 to 18. When Gentiles don't come to Jerusalem for this Feast of Tabernacles, no rain on them, the curse of the law will come into operation on nations that don't obey, but on Jerusalem itself and on Israel, there will be no more curse of the law. But on top of that, as we saw in Isaiah chapter 65 and verse 17, the youth will die at the age of 100. The curse of Adam still exists, but it's been greatly minimized. So there will still be curse in the New Jerusalem, in the Millennium Jerusalem, and there'll still be curse amongst Israel, but no curse of the law. The curse of the law are done away with because they followed the law, because the Holy Spirit has circumcised their hearts. Does that make sense? So there'll still be the curse of Adam in terms of you're going to die. And the day you eat of the fruit, you shall surely die. That still exists, but people are living for long years. It's been greatly minimized. But when it comes to the curses of the law, your curse will be your kneading bowl, curse will be you in the city, curse will be you in the country, the land will spew you out. All those stuff will not exist anymore in the millennium for Israel. But then when we come into the New Jerusalem, God will even deal with the curse that came in through Adam. So there's no more curse whatsoever. Then we see that there's one tree, the tree of life. In here, there's one tree in Ezekiel chapter 47, verse 7, says there are many trees all along the banks of this river of life that comes from the temple. Right? Many trees. Here, one tree. And we also see, we've also seen that there's a new heavens and new earth in both the millennium and the New Jerusalem. A high mountain is both in the millennium and the New Jerusalem. There are 12 gates in the millennium Jerusalem and in the New Jerusalem, and they'll always be opened. We see that kings are going to bring their glory in the millennium and in the New Jerusalem. There's going to be a river of life in the millennium and in the New Jerusalem, and there's going to be no curse of the law in the millennium and in the New Jerusalem. which makes it look like it's the same place, right? It looks like the same place because it's both the same on all these points. But then we see that this new heavens and new earth is reconstituted out of what already exists. That's different. There's no sea, but here in the Millennium, there's two seas at least, the Mediterranean and the Dead Sea. There's no death. Here there is death. Now here there will be no crying in both. No cries, no crying, no tears for God's people. No tears, no pain for God's people. That's the same, but here there's death. And then we see here, it says no sun, moon, stars. Well, that's the same in both. There'll be no, over Jerusalem here, there'll be no sun, moon, and stars. That's what it says in the Millennium. And that you'll see in Isaiah 60 verse 19. No sun, moon, or stars. But here it says day or night. There'll be night. But in the New Jerusalem, no night. If that makes sense. And then it says that there'll be a river of life in both the Millennium and in the New Jerusalem, but there's a tree of life here, but there are trees here. There is no more curse, no curse of the law in either this one or this one, but there is the curse of death in this one. There's no curse of death in this one. Death's been obliterated. There are differences between the Millennium and the New Jerusalem, but there are certain things that are the same. Now, if we just ignored these differences, we'd say, well, it's the same place. New heavens and new earth. It's the same place. But then you're ignoring the differences. We recognize that there are differences. Therefore, the Millennium is not the New Jerusalem. They're two different things. But the people who believe they're the same thing, they're called amillennial, they say, no, it's the same thing. Look at all these similarities. What do you say about that? And this is what I say about it. The similarities are there because this one is a picture of this one. So if there were no similarities, how would it be a picture of the New Jerusalem? It wouldn't be a picture of it at all. There has to be similarities between the two in order that this one teaches us about this one. Does that make sense? We also see the similarities and differences with Eden. Okay? Eden, the time of Eden, the earth had a sea. It says there were sea and seas. God created it on the fourth day, all the different seas. And that's in chapter 1, Genesis. It's all Genesis here, Genesis. Chapter 1 and verse 2 and verse 10. The earth was covered in water. That was the original chaos. The earth was tohu, was formless and void, was a great chaos. And out of that chaos, God brought order with his word. There's no chaos in the New Jerusalem. There's no longer any sea. We see that there are no tears and no pain or no crying. Before the fall, in Eden there were no tears, no pain, no crying. God was dwelling among men in Eden. He walked about among them. Sorry? There was no death before the fall. There's no death before the fall. Do we find kings? Here we have kings. Do we find kings in Eden? Yes. Let us make man in our image and let them rule. Adam and Eve. There are kings on the earth. What's different is there is a sun, moon, and stars. In the first creation, the first heavens and earth. There is a tree of life. And there is a river that comes out of Eden. There's a river that comes out of Eden, and it divides into 4 rivers and waters the earth. There's a river. And before the fall, there was no curse, no more curse. There are similarities, but there are differences. We don't read of a bride of God there in the garden. We don't read of a tabernacle, but we do see God is dwelling amongst his people. Everything was new, but we don't read of a high mountain. We don't read of gates or foundation stones. We don't read of a golden street or a temple. But we do read about these other things. Some things were the same, and some things were different. Now, there's one more difference between the Millennium and the New Jerusalem that I didn't pick up on here. But the size of Jerusalem here is 2,220 kilometers, over 10 billion kilometers cubed. In Ezekiel 48, okay, we're going to have to look at two sections of Ezekiel. There's Ezekiel 48 and there's Ezekiel 45. So let's firstly go to Ezekiel 45. Where's the size? Ezekiel 45 and Ezekiel 48. Okay. It says, this is like a greater Jerusalem. It's what the Bible here calls the holy portion. But it's like Jerusalem's environs around it. We could call it Greater Jerusalem. And it says it's basically 25,000 cubits in length. In fact, that whole portion, if you put it all together with the priest's portion and everything, it's 25,000 cubits by 25,000 cubits. A cubit is about 0.5 something, 525 meters. Okay? So if you divide 25,000 by that, you'll come to an area of 13.125 kilometers. That makes it 172.26 kilometers squared. Now, the present day Jerusalem, in terms of the wider area, is 125 kilometers squared. So that wider area is going to be even bigger than what we see today. But the area of the city itself, with the walls and the gates, is smaller. And that's in chapter 48 and verse 30 to 35. The walls and the gates are 4,500 cubits each. That equals 2.3625 kilometers, so over 2 kilometers in length, that wall. 2 kilometers in length, that wall, over that. And if you square it, it equals 5.581 kilometers squared. Now, the old city in Jerusalem is only 1 kilometer squared. If you think of it, that old city where the wall, surrounded by that wall, is much, much smaller. It's a fifth of the size of the millennial Jerusalem. And the greatest Jerusalem around it is smaller than what that big holy allotment is going to be in the future. But nowhere near as big as the New Jerusalem. How do you make that the same as that? You can't. We can account for the similarities between the two. Why? Because we say this is a picture of this, so it's got to be similar in order to teach it and picture it. And just as Eden is similar to the New Jerusalem, but there are differences. There's no marriage. Here there is marriage. Eden has similarities. Why? Because the New Jerusalem is going to be a more glorious Eden than even the first one. The New Jerusalem is going to be even more glorious Jerusalem than the millennial Jerusalem. One is a picture of the other. But the amill guys who say there is no millennium, who try and make them the same, they cannot account for the differences. So what they have to do is reinterpret differences, reinterpret this and say it's not actually what it's saying. Like here there's death. If a person dies at the end, no, it doesn't really mean that. It just means that people live forever. No, it says if he dies, it can't make sense if death is an impossibility. It's like saying if you see a rabbit with 65 heads on it, you got to know it's an unusual rabbit. You're like, well, I'll never see that. It's not even a possibility. So you're not making any sense. Why would God say if a person dies at the age of 100, he'll be thought accursed? If it's impossible for someone to die. The fact that he speaks about the death and speaks about the disobedience of nations coming to Jerusalem means that it's a possibility. The curse of death still exists. The curse of the law for Israel has been done away with.